College football nerds, we are doing a way too early top 10. We've never done one of these, and we're not doing a top 25 because we don't want you here all day. People got stuff to do. And honestly, at some point, it becomes an exercise in hilariousness of speculation. Josh is with me. We're going to be nerdy in this, not too nerdy. Want to remind you, please like and subscribe, but give us your way too early top 10 as well, and we will talk about it and tell you how wrong you are in the comments. Diving right in, we're going 10 to 1. We've been going 1 to 10. We're going to go 10 to 1. My number 10 is LSU, and you may not have LSU in your top 10. You seem to be really down on them, and that's okay. They can prove you wrong. I think with Brennan showing me what he showed me, and I think he'll come back healthy for this season, maybe his final season. He's been there for 12 years. I think that they are poised with the guys they have coming back. It's the opposite situation from last year where they had nobody coming back. Now they have a lot of experience coming back. Pelini wasn't the right fit. I think they're going to have some improvement on defense. And their SEC East crossers are Florida, who I think is going to get decimated this year and not be that good. So it's a winnable game. In Kentucky, who I don't think is going to be very good. And their out-of-conference game is UCLA. So to me, I think they've got a lot of schedule ease that maybe they didn't have in 2020. Give me your number 10.
Yeah, and my number 10 is not LSU. I saw a lot of issues from them last year, and I think Brennan will help, but I think they're going to feel the losses of guys like Eric Gilbert on top of everybody else they've lost. It's just going to be a lot of discontinuity continued into this season. My number 10 is North Carolina. They return a lot of guys. They lose some guys at key positions, and that's why they're back at 10, and I debated it. I like Howell as a quarterback. I like how many guys they get back on defense. I do not like the losses at receiver and running back. I think those guys made a lot of stuff work for North Carolina when it did work. I've always felt like Longo's offense is very boom or bust, and without guys that consistently win one-on-ones, the offense can bust more than it hits. But still, given the defense, given the landscape of the ACC, I think North Carolina is positioned well.
I don't have them on top 10 for some of those reasons you mentioned. They've got a ton of guys coming back, but they have a ton of guys coming back off of a fringe top 25 team. They do avoid Clemson in the regular season, which might help them a little bit. Number 9, I've got Notre Dame. I think everybody's ready for Notre Dame to just fall off the map. I don't think that's going to ever happen with Kelly running the show. I do think this year they take a step back from being a team that can go undefeated-ish and make the playoffs. For me, I've got them at number 9. Give me your number 9.
It's also Notre Dame. They lose a lot of guys. I mean, they lose a lot of guys. Everybody knows when you lose a quarterback, but people don't miss when you're losing the majority of your starters on offense and about half your defense. Notre Dame is still Notre Dame, though. They're a well-coached team. They're a very talented team. Their schedule is always consistently good, and one of the most important schedules in football for always scheduling a challenging set of names. But a lot of those teams are not necessarily peaking right now. And so I think they sneak their way into the top 10, but I don't think they're going to be what they were last year.
Number 8, I've got Cincinnati. I think it's interesting because they do play Indiana, who's also going to be flirting with the top 10 this year, coming off the season they had. Cincinnati was a really good team last year. And I think people get confused when we say you're not a playoff team versus and having that be a dismissal of them entirely. They were still a really good team with an elite defense. I think the Georgia game proved out that they weren't a playoff team because that Georgia team, without all their defensive players, was not a playoff caliber team either. So I think in that regard, they weren't a top 4 team, but I still think they were deserving of their top 10 ranking last year, and I got them in there again. Give me your number 8.
My number 8 is the team Cincinnati plays, Indiana. I think the team that wins the Cincinnati-Indiana game, which I think is week 3, is going to end up being a top 10 team. And with Indiana, I don't expect Penix to be quite the same quarterback coming year off the ACL. I just usually guys like Daniels aren't quite recovered yet. And I worry a little bit of an offense that was at times flashed, but also very inconsistent, like we talked about in another one of our videos. My thing with Indiana is you return almost the entire defense from what was easily one of the best in the Big Ten. Indiana's probably going to have one of the top defenses in the country next year, and you expect that Indiana-Cincinnati game to be the dark horse top 10 team matchup, and it's probably going to be a low-scoring affair, showcasing two of the better defenses from a non-blue blood program in the country.
I've got Oregon at number 7. Oregon had a little bit of a disappointing year in 2020. There was a lot of screwiness with the Pac-12 in general with COVID in 2020. Also, they had a ton of guys opt out that I think will not be a problem for them in 21. But they also play Ohio State, and I don't think they're better than Ohio State. So people are going to drop them for that loss. And I think it's going to be enough to keep them from really being that top 3-4 type team, because they're probably looking at like a 10-2 sort of year, which is good enough to be in the top 10, but not good enough to be in the playoffs.
I also have Oregon number 7, and I think we're in agreement on this. Oregon won the Pac-12. I think a lot of people seem to be picking USC as the top team. I think it's going to be Oregon, and I know Oregon, they're losing some guys, again, both sides of the ball. Great, wonderful. That was a team that was decimated by opt-outs, and they still found a way to win the conference title. They looked at times pretty dominant on the defensive line, and they're going to be as good or better this upcoming year. They get Thibodeau back. The secondary really was just crippled by COVID. I expect them to round into form. And the offense, as shaky as it was, is probably going to be as good this year. And probably is going to have time to actually get some consistency. So I do think Oregon ends up being the best team in the Pac-12, and the recruiting gains that they've been making behind the scenes are probably going to really start to show up on the field.
Next team up for me is Texas A&M, and this is a team that we have either caught a lot of flack for or caught a lot of praise for in the past, and I think we've been on them every year. For many years leading up to last season, we talked about how they were good enough to be ranked, and it was unfair that they weren't ranked. When you play 4 teams in your 12-game schedule that were ranked number 1 at some point, that's tough. It's tough to win any of those games, and you got to win one of those games to get ranked. They didn't. Last year, we were like, okay, A&M has been a good team. They are a really good team this year. They are not a playoff team this year. So either we're going to get hate from A&M fans or we're going to get hate from people who hate A&M, but that's okay. I mean, we are intellectually consistent on them, and I think we were right. I think they had a really good win against North Carolina. I don't know how it turned out to be a 2-touchdown win. It was. They were not a playoff team last year, and I think we saw that. Give me your number 6.
It is also Texas A&M.
This is getting frustrating.
It is also Texas A&M. And no, we did not plan this. But here's the thing for me with 7 and up. I think we talk a lot about groupings. There's a group in the top 7 that seems to be. And I'll give you guys, go ahead and give you a disclosure. Right when we started, we pasted in our top 10 so that we would know what the other person was talking about. As we talked about it, they're the same teams, and they're really the teams that are hot on the recruiting trail that have high level coaching and they're trending up. A&M is getting to that level. Like, it's funny. I took heat for saying that it was unfair that A&M wasn't ranked, and then everybody was piling on me for being an A&M lover, and last year I said they were good but not great and probably more of a fringe top 10 team than a top 5 team, and I got hate from A&M fans. The reality is I think A&M went from being something like the 20 to 25th best team to maybe the 9th best team or 8th best team. It feels high having them at number 6, but I just don't know who I'd necessarily put above them right now. But the recruiting has been good, even by SEC standards. It is a well-coached team. I felt like the offense was holding them back a little bit from Mond. And they're kind of a boom or bust pick depending on the quarterback situation and how much more modern they look with a different quarterback if Jimbo Fisher is able to shake off the clunkiness that they've had in recent years.
Real quick on A&M, because I think a lot of people are going to, who maybe haven't followed them closely but haven't been as critical as us about Mond, will say, well, they're losing their quarterback who's been there forever. They're going to take a step back, right? But I think you would agree with me in saying that may not be the case. Mond might have actually been holding them back a little bit.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Last year, Mond was not overly impressive, and he had some good games, but he had his normal half the season was a clunker performance. The bigger deal for me is like DeMarvin Leal is a monster for the D line for them. They've got pieces that have been slowly cropping up that are now building into a high level talented unit that can challenge the LSUs and the Auburns and the Alabamas and the SEC. And one of that group, LSU, Auburn, Texas A&M, is probably going to be a top 10 team around this slot. We've both picked A&M, but it's recruiting that's taking hold for me, and I think that's going to solve a lot of ills from guys they lost from last year.
My number 5 is a team that I also think could easily win the national championship. It's just I have concerns with Ohio State, given that they are replacing a quarterback. And I don't know that it's not entirely fair because it's not all about the quarterback. And I've got Alabama higher than them, and Alabama's replacing a quarterback. But we have seen a lot of reloading from Ohio State with mainstays at quarterback. And I think that they've not trended in a great direction with Justin Fields. So I thought 2019 Ohio State was an elite challenge for the national championship. We had them number 1 all-year team. I think they took a step back in 2019 or in 2020. And that was with Justin Fields. So I don't know what we're going to get out of quarterback in this season, which scares me a little bit. And I think the teams ahead of them all are all better situated defensively. So I've got them at number 5. Give me your number 5.
My number 5 is Georgia, and it's sort of the tale of two sides of the ball for Georgia. Offensively, you have to be encouraged. They've had a lot of issues in recent years. It's just not quite having the right pieces at every position. Getting Blaylock back from injury, combining him with Pickens, combining him with a guy that I think is going to be one of the breakout players in college football in Burton, they've got the makings of a really dynamic, good offense. My concern with Georgia is when they lost defensive starters, and I know this happens to every defense when they lose starters, but the backups just don't feel like the same quality as the starters. I did not feel like they got the same production from those second level or second team defensive players, and it wasn't just about experience. I think it was more than that, and there was hits really throughout the depth chart. I think the defense takes a significant step back. But anything for me, I will say, I talked about the group with 7. The group 5 and above, starting with Georgia, any one of these teams could win the national title. It wouldn't surprise me. And, I think all of these teams have a good shot to make the playoff. I'll go ahead and move on to my number 4 because it was your number 5, and that's Ohio State. I have them a little bit higher. I have the same concerns you do. They lose their quarterback. They lose key pieces. But, personally, I think the return of Tyreek Smith and Chris Olave is what bumps them up for me. Those two guys really shore up a couple positions to make them positions of strength where if they'd left, they would have been much more of a question mark. It will help a quarterback, certainly to have an elite receiver in Olave, to pair with Wilson and everybody else they've got. And they've got probably the best depth in college football, top to bottom at receiving core. Alabama may have an argument, and Clemson would make an argument with it. But in terms of 5 stars and whatnot, they're probably more stacked than anybody else. Ohio State has all the pieces to be successful. I just don't know what it's going to look like. And I think all of us are a little concerned given the holes we saw in their secondary and how much Justin Fields felt to that offense.
I do think the Olave point is a good one. I also think that he's a wide receiver. We saw when he was out versus Northwestern, that offense sort of fell apart. So that is, wasn't great for that game, even though they still won, but it's encouraging for him to come back. The next 2 on my list play one another, and that's Georgia and Clemson. Right now I have Clemson ahead of Georgia at number 3 because I think that early season matchup against one another, coming back to your point about Georgia missing defensive players, I think Georgia's defense is going to be fine. Look, it's Kirby Smart's defenses are always going to be fine. Georgia's had an elite defense since he's been there. I think they're going to be fine. The problem is when you're replacing a lot of starters, what you don't want to do in the first couple of weeks of the season is play Clemson. You want to play them in week 7 or 10, the elite offense, and not when you're bringing in a lot of new guys. Do you want to play them first game of the season? So that concerns me a little bit, and it's a situation where I think that it is very likely that Clemson wins that game, and by the end of the year, Georgia is a better team. But people are going to have a hard time putting Georgia ahead of Clemson because of head-to-head and the fact that Clemson don't play nobody, Paul. After that game, they don't play anybody, and that's, again, not their fault. They scheduled 2 out-of-conference Power 5 games, both against SEC teams. They can't help that South Carolina sucks. They can't help that the rest of the ACC sucks, and they miss Miami and North Carolina. But because of that, they're going to be ranked really high, and they're going to moonwalk into the playoffs. Even if they lose to Georgia, they can still make the playoffs. I've got Clemson at number 3, Georgia at number 4, and that's not a slight to Georgia. It's just kind of bad luck for them. I haven't picked it yet. We haven't done a preview, but I think Georgia is gonna ride to win the East pretty easily. Give me your number 3.
My number 3 is Oklahoma. Offensively, it's hard to really question whether they're going to be good at this point. And I think with Hazelwood and some of the young guys, they've got Williams and they've got guys like Kennedy Brooks that have experience. They're going to fill the holes. I mean, are they going to miss Ramondre Stevenson? Yes. We had a lot of back and forth with Oklahoma fans about how important he was or was not to the offense. Certainly looked important in the Florida game and made me look a little silly to really question if he was a part of the turnaround, but I'm also not sure that Florida was worth a flip in that game. Regardless, to the extent that I didn't feel like Stevenson was making a huge impact or some of these guys were really that important, that turns around when you're looking at the next year. I don't think they're going to feel that loss all that significantly. You've got a good guy in Kennedy Brooks. I think you're just going to feel like the same offense with more experience. And I think the quarterback position with Spencer Rattler is going to really turn things around just by having a guy that's probably going to be a more confident, experienced quarterback without the inconsistencies we saw last year. Combine that with a defense that looked radically better at the end of the year, assuming the offensive line plays at a high level, which is very important for Lincoln Riley's scheme. I think Oklahoma is absolutely a playoff team. I have them number 3. Sounds like you have them even higher, but we can get into the next 2.
So I've got Alabama at number 2 and Oklahoma at number 1. Alabama, I think, will drop a game at some point in the season. I still think they're a playoff team. Look, I might piss off some Alabama fans here, but Bryce Young looked to me, and this is not fair because he did not get a spring camp. He's a true freshman coming in, and it felt like Alabama never wanted to block for the kid when he came in mop-up duty. He looked like he's got a great command of his arm and where he's throwing the ball, but not a great command as a quarterback, and that concerned me a little bit. Now, I'm not ready to write the kid off. I think he's an elite talent. Like you were with Mac Jones last summer, I am with Bryce Young right now. I'm going to wait and see. Alabama's losing so much production, and it doesn't matter. I mean, they're still Alabama, and they're still going to win a ton of games, and they're still probably going to be most people's favorite for the national championship. But we got to see on quarterback because there's going to be a game or two where Alabama's got to put up 40 points to win. And they might do it, and as long as Saban's there, it's not really great to bet against him. I've got Oklahoma at number 1 because, like you said, the defense is much improved. Also, I'm not high on the Big 12 this year, and we look at who Oklahoma plays out of conference. It's Tulane, Western Carolina, and Nebraska. Again, this isn't Oklahoma's fault that Nebraska isn't any good. It pains me that an Oklahoma-Nebraska matchup is not that exciting, but who's going to beat Oklahoma this year? I mean, I know in the past they've had these knucklehead games against an Iowa State or a Kansas State or whatever, but it doesn't feel like at the tail end of last year that was going to be their trajectory going into this year. So I've got them number 1, but it's a coin flip, man. It is. Give me the rest of yours and let's get out of here.
My number 2 is Alabama, and my number 1 is Clemson. You mentioned about who's going to beat Oklahoma, and the team to me that beats Oklahoma is going to beat them in the playoff. Because when you start ranking the top 4, or a lot of times we rank teams 4 to 6, at this point, we're really not even comparing you to your conference. We're comparing you to the best team in another conference, and things get a little sticky. And not only that, but things that work for you relative to teams that are average to good to really good by P5 standards often shut down against elites. And things that work against an elite sometimes aren't even really flashing until that point. And that was the Clemson deep passing game. And that's why I have Clemson number one, really, is they're going to get back Justin Ross. I think DJ Uiagalelei has absolutely looked like the best backup quarterback in the country, and I think there's every reason to think he's going to be a superstar. I saw the same things you saw from Bryce Young. There were flashes of why he was a number one, number two overall recruit in a lot of recruiting services. But his size is a factor, and he looked a little out of sorts. Now, he had no spring practice, probably barely got time to practice going into the season given COVID. I think he's going to look like a very different guy when he's given the reins. But I don't think he physically looks as game ready as DJ, who is built like an NFL player today. The receiving core for Clemson is a lot more proven. They're going to get healthy. I know they've got guys. Alabama's going to has a tremendous amount of talent in terms of depth, but not a lot of proven super high level players, really none. And that concerns me, that Justin Ross factor. Now, I do think, why is Alabama number two? Because the defense is going to be really, really good. They bring a lot of guys back. They have a tremendous amount of talent, some of the best recruiting on the defensive side of the ball in history the past few years. And that's going to start to show, you would think, probably this year. They're going to become a dominant defense for a year or two, given that defensive talent. I just think the offensive firepower that Clemson is probably going to be able to bring to bear next year, to me, makes them the favorite. Even though they lost a ton of guys, the guys they're replacing them with are freaks, and they return really the entire starting defense at Clemson. So you pair that firepower with a tremendous amount of experience, and you have a really good team. I'm going to make one point that we'll probably talk about at some point at length before next season starts, and I think you're probably going to agree with me. 2020 was the sloppiest, worst football played in decades, probably, because of COVID, nationally, the lack of teams. That is going to turn on its head in 2021 because a lot of these teams are getting seniors back that shouldn't be eligible anymore. A lot of these teams are having guys that were thrown into the fire due to COVID opt-outs in 2020. That means they're losing less players going into 2021. Your Terrace Marshalls around the country, a lot of them opted out. So your juniors that would have normally been replaced by a freshman were already replaced. And so their backups are already ready to go. And there are really a lot fewer of those third-year players that were meaningful contributors because so many of them did opt out. So I think, like, for example, Alabama has Chris Owens, who started the national title, who's going to be a six-year senior starting for him on the O-line. I think 2021 will probably have the best all-around football and the most prepared, complete football teams in many years, and it's going to make for a much more competitive all-around season than we saw last year or probably in recent memory.
Yeah, teams were artificially bad or were artificially able to prepare for teams and make other teams look artificially bad that we're not going to see in 2021. I think it's a good point. I think you're going to see the good teams be really good, and you're probably going to see more separation, more of this maybe frustrating lack of parity because the good teams that are well coached it's really going to prove out this year even more than it did in 2020, and that might be a little scary. And look, people are going to be frustrated. Look, our top 10 is probably what it's going to look like a little bit at the end of the year. And who are we talking about? Oklahoma, Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State. And people are bored with that. I say beat them. I mean, Clemson, we are a little frustrated because nobody in the ACC is stepping up, although I think we talked about Florida State being maybe good in 2020 and jumped the gun. I think this year they are going to be a much better team, but I really wish North Carolina and Clemson played, but they don't. All right, let us know in the comments what you think your top 10 should be or is going to be. I know it's a little early and things change, and maybe we do another one of these in the summer, but for now, give us your 2021 top 10, and we'll get at you in the comments. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.